am very pleased to tell you that my name is Kim Gallo and I get to be principal at Shepaug. Today is one of those days that it's a true pleasure to be the principal of this school. When you listen to the radio, when you look at the television, anything that you do in this world right now gets a little scary. There's a trial going on right now for one terrorist, and there are terrorists that are active all over the world. Some of us read about it, some of us worry about it. At Shepaug, we take the time to study it. I think that is a very strong statement about us as a learning community, and my students will speak for themselves. You'll see just how well they do that, just how curious they are about their world, just how intelligent they are about analyzing and thinking about what is happening in our world, and just how creative they are in promoting solutions. That is what makes today such a great day to be a principal. When you look up at our core values and guiding beliefs, one of the things that it says is answering a call to citizenship. Our students have done that very, very well today. And you don't need me to tell you that because you're about to find out. It is my great pleasure to introduce the person that put this all together, and that is Anne Marie O'Rourke.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd first like to thank you all for coming here. I'm really excited that we have such a great turnout. I'm really excited that all of my fellow students over here are able to work their hardest and get all of their work done. It's not too often you see people willing to come out on a Saturday afternoon to see a bunch of teenagers talk about world affairs, so I'm really thankful to see all of that. I'm really excited to be running this forum this year. After being a participant last year, I knew that I wanted to carry it out as a legacy and host the 12th annual World Affairs Forum, which I'm doing so now. I wanted to pursue a career in foreign affairs since my sophomore year. Before then, I hated foreign affairs, never cared for it, but thanks to Mr. Dennis, he really showed me what the world was all about and got me interested in it. So by doing this forum, I knew that it would be able to enhance my interest even further and gain a better knowledge on the world around me, which it has. I really just hope that you all enjoy it and appreciate all the hard work that these kids have put into it, because they definitely put their all into it these past few days, so I'm really excited about it. And of course, our special guest speaker, Dr. Sergey Kabelov, to join us, so thank you for that. And Mr. Dennis, come on over.
Well, I want to, again, I guess I should do as I say, right? I usually am not a fan of microphones, but if we're going to make you guys do that, right, I might as well. I want to thank you guys for coming. Each year, I'm always amazed at the interest that our kids have. We don't have many. You know, we have 250 kids in this school, and each year 40 or 50 kids come and express interest in the Model UN Club. Which almost all of our panelists today have participated in some form, in some way. They have an incredible enthusiasm for ideas, and this is just really a wonderful way to celebrate that enthusiasm. That can't happen without people who are willing to engage and support and validate and bring to life the wonderful ideas that you'll see today. So we really appreciate that. I appreciate the work that Anna has put in. She's done a wonderful job facilitating and coordinating and also talking to me, which I know oftentimes is not always high on the checklist, right? But she's done a wonderful job. It's my honor and pleasure really to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Kabelov. He's been an absolute asset to this school, simply because he likes kids, he likes ideas, and he likes to celebrate them. You know, I was first introduced to Dr. Kabelov last year from Joe Baxter, the president of the United Nations Association. And really, he's been wonderfully gracious. He spoke to my foreign policy class. He spoke at Sarah Williams' TED discussion last year, and he agreed this year to be our guest speaker. So he brings a really interesting and unique perspective. He volunteers his time. We're incredibly grateful and thankful for having you give up your Saturday and to speak to our young people and to engage in dialogue. We'll have Dr. Kingeloff will give his thoughts on this very broad question. It's an incredibly broad question if you look at it. It's the first thing we talk about. How do you prevent and combat? Oftentimes go hand in hand. So it's a huge question. We understand that. We don't expect to answer that question wholly today, but to give some really unique perspective. So I really want to thank you, Dr. Kingeloff, on behalf of the entire region for giving so much of yourself and your time to this school. And we look forward to today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dennis. It's my third time in this school, and I come with a great pleasure, and it's an honor for me to be here again and to interact with bright kids of this school. I was very impressed the first time last year with the maturity, level of preparedness, interest that students of this school showed, which is much, much higher than what you normally see in American universities and colleges. And maybe it's this?
I think someone just knocked the dials.
Okay. Because I tend to speak forever. To leave time for the main participants today, for the panelists and interaction with the audience and the panelists. So I'll try to be as brief as I can with this, which never happens. Okay? Maybe I can you hear me without this thing?
My mother can't hear you without
Okay.
it.
Well, I'll try my best. When we first met, and I gave a talk on international politics, one thing I tried to impress on the participants is that in international politics, nothing is black or white. There are all shades of gray, many more than 50. But one thing that gave me pause then and still gives me pause today is the question of terrorism. Probably it's the only event, phenomenon in international affairs that is more to the black side of the whole spectrum. It's very difficult, if you do it seriously and honestly, to find gray, certainly not white. As Mr. Dennis said, it's a huge topic and we are not going to cover everything today. And I'm not here to teach. I'm here to share with you my opinions, and I have plenty of those, my impressions, my views, and try to help you deal with this huge issue, hone your angle, your understanding, maybe provoke you, we'll see. But what I'm trying to do is, of course, I want to share with you my personal views on the opinions. I do not represent radioactive. By necessity, I will jump from one subject to another, and our panelists will go deeper into the areas that they decided they want to speak about. So please pardon me if my statements seem to be not fully explored and finished. First, to design a strategy to respond to the main question of today's forum, how the United States needs to interact with other partners in combating terrorism, we need to define several notions. To define a strategy, you have to understand what you're dealing with, first of all. So the question of what is terrorism comes to everybody's mind immediately. There is no accepted definition of terrorism. United Nations have been unable to come to agreed definition of terrorism for many, many reasons. and we'll talk about it a little bit later. How grave is this threat of terrorism? Contrary to what you may believe, not everybody believes that there is a huge threat of terrorism right now in the world. And I'm talking about American public and even scholars. There is a discussion on this subject which goes on right now. What do terrorists want, actually? Why the number of terrorists is growing? Why this phenomenon is propagated? So what is terrorism? Anyone who even starts thinking about terrorism comes across a very cynical statement. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And that is, of course, very, very true. Just remember one example. When the Soviets were in Afghanistan, the Mujahideens were freedom fighters. Now they are terrorists. Same people, same weapons, given to them by the United States, by the way. So this shows the fluidity of the whole concept of who is terrorist. Nevertheless, the United Nations, all countries members of the United Nations, all 192 more of them, I don't remember right now, agreed on one thing, and I'll quote, and this, I promise this will be the only quote today. All the countries agreed on condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, committed by whomever, wherever, and for whatever purposes. Which shows that the world is more or less united in trying to combat or even eradicate terrorism. The question is, how do we actually do this? How grave is this threat? Normal people tend to believe that this threat is very, very grave. But there is also a concept which is called terrorism delusion. And people who advocate this approach say that what happened on 9/11 was an aberration. It was one single instance of terrorists being very successful in what they were trying to do. After this, knock on wood, there was no anything comparable to the magnitude of what happened in New York in 2001. And some people say that the threat of terrorism is overblown by people who are directly interested, I mean, intelligence services, law enforcement, and so on. They do it for their own purposes. I don't buy this concept. I'm very concerned about terrorism and the threats that terrorism presents. There is a statement which seems like a joke, but it's not a joke. Military planners say to them among themselves, we know that we are paranoid. The big question is, are we paranoid enough? I don't think we are paranoid enough. And I personally believe that it's just a question of when, not if, something terrible happens again. Weapons of mass destruction, dirty bombs, cyber terrorism. I can go on, and you know about it, and you hear about it every day. By the way, President Obama, in his speech to the United Nations most recently, mentioned three main threats. One was international terrorism, another was Ebola, and the third was Russia. well, I'm Russian. Well, my origins were in Russia, so I'm a little bit surprised by this. And I believe that the focus on danger coming from states, be it Russia, be it North Korea, or Iran, detracts from more real and present danger coming from international terrorism. I don't believe, I cannot foresee Russia attacking the United States or even North Korea. But terrorism is a very real and present danger, and I believe it has to be at the forefront of all security, intelligence, and military planning for most countries, in particular for the United States. Should we care about terrorist acts that seem to not affect the United States, like Boko Haram? We are going to have this discussion today, and I hope we'll have an answer to this question. What do terrorists want? Remember, after 9/11, President Bush said that it was an attack against American way of life, American values. And if this is so, there is no possibility of compromise, of discussion. But maybe there is something else, not so universal and comprehensive as an attack against American way of life. What did Bin Laden want at that time, even before 9/11? He wanted American troops out of Saudi Arabia, first of all, and later from the Middle East in general. This is something that I believe you can deal with. You can try to find a solution to this kind of goals, demands. One more thing. I think we have to make a distinction between the goals of terrorist organization, a terrorist organization, and individual terrorists who may indeed hate the American way of life and see their mission in life, in eternal life, to kill as many Americans as possible. But maybe this is not what the organization that they belong to wants. Maybe they want something that can be a subject of negotiation or a discussion. Again, it's a question. I don't have answers to all the questions that I pose. Roots. Where does terrorism come from? And we are going to cover this, I'm sure, in almost all of the presentations by our panelists. The traditional way of approaching is very straightforward. Huge numbers of young, unemployed males in developing countries, in particular in the Middle East, with nothing to do, no source of income, despair, and so on. Unemployment leads to marginalization in societies, leads to the feeling of victimization, and they become very easy to be radicalized. You just have to point a finger and say, this is your enemy. And everything which is happening to you, everything bad is coming from them. That was a traditional approach, and it was even called causes of terrorism. But it's, in fact, a slippery slope to condoning at least some terrorist acts. If there is a cause, then there might be some legitimacy in an action, right? So now the formula that is accepted by the United Nations, by all members, is conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, international terrorism, or conditions that terrorists may take advantage of. It's not a cause and effect. It's just a situation which does not, never justifies terrorist acts or incitement to terrorism. What conditions do member states of the United Nations have in mind? Prolonged, unresolved conflicts. Number one is, of course, Palestine-Israel. For 60 years, goes on, and the United Nations cannot do anything in this regard. Lack of rule of law, violations of human rights, ethnic, national, or religious discrimination, political exclusion, socio-economic marginalization. All of these are believed to be conditions that tend to propagate terrorism. But the interesting question now, and again, I don't have the answer, is why ISIS is so attractive to young people. Young, educated people, born and raised in developed countries, Britain, United States, France. Why do they go to Syria and Iraq and join ISIS now? I say educated with good grades, suddenly leave their homes and go there. Why? I don't know. Maybe you know. Maybe you understand this. The question that comes to mind whenever we think about terrorism, international terrorism now, is of course Islamic terrorism. Again, the United Nations, in all of its documents of recent years, stated that terrorism should not, cannot, could not, and should not be associated with any particular religion, ethnicity, or country. And this is a very profound statement, and we have to keep it in mind. I saw the slides that we are going to see during your presentations, and mostly you will see people in Islamic dress and so on. And that shows the principal area of our concern about international terrorism right now. But we should never forget that terrorism did not appear on 9/11 of 2001. It has been there forever. And a couple of decades ago, we spoke mainly about terrorism in Europe, in Northern Ireland, in the Basque Country, in Peru, Sendero Luminoso, and others. So we have to remember this not to be one-sided. How do we counter terrorism, international terrorism? And in some statements, the task is eradicate international terrorism. Most terrorist acts right now are against the United States or United States interests. Should it mean that the United States should go alone in fighting terrorists, or should accept the principal responsibility for fighting terrorists? The US has military means to do this, intelligence, law enforcement, and so on. But again, United Nations member states agree that there is no purely military solution to the question of international terrorism, the problem of international terrorism. It takes much more than that. It's a global issue, and it needs a global response. So the United States, if it decides to go alone, by necessity, it will eventually lead to violation of international law, human rights. International law. Remember when the US did it with Noriega in Panama? The raid to kill Osama bin Laden was also technically a violation of Pakistan's sovereignty. The drones It's a big question, big debate right now. Human rights, many people believe that Guantanamo is a violation of human rights. But the whole essence of the fight against terrorism is to protect human rights, protect security, protect civil liberties. So again, the question is how do you balance this? What I mean to say here is maybe the principal thrust of my talk today. Dealing with terrorism, trying to combat terrorism, involves a huge complex of morally agonizing questions to which we don't have answers right now. Let me mention just a few. Torture. One of my favorite serials on TV was 24. First seasons. And you see torture all the time. Can torture be justified? If you torture one man to save many other lives, how many lives would be many? 1,000? 100? 2? Or 1 if it's somebody you love? I don't have an answer to this question. Collateral damage. Civilians always get hurt. Always. The question is, how big is the collateral damage? And we all know that any collateral damage creates new terrorists. It's the biggest recruitment tool. How do you deal with it? Freedom of information. Public's right to know. Snowden. Is he a hero or a traitor? Again, I don't know the categorical answer to this question, and I don't think there is any. And, you know, intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies need to keep their successes secret. Because talking about a victory against terrorism will often involve sharing secrets of how this victory was achieved, what intelligence methods were used. And of course, it's something that is not very desirable. And then again, it works in a very interesting way. One, what terrorists want to do, they want to intimidate public. And secrecy, necessary secrecy, doesn't permit public to be educated about successes in fight against terrorism. So see, there is a dynamic again that is not one-sided or very linear. The principle, we do not negotiate with terrorists. How absolute is this? Are there any situations when you must negotiate? Or are you creating the rooms of your own failure and problems in the future? It is always often said that effective response to terrorism, any measures to combat terrorism, are not always compatible with democratic values. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association. For example, when you say that it's criminal, it's now criminal, the United Nations has adopted these legal instruments. It's criminal to incite to commit terrorist acts. How do you define incitement? Where is the boundary between speaking about the socioeconomic, religious, political problems, inequality, and so on, and incitement to terrorism? It's a very fine line. Why I am saying all this? Probably just to repeat again, that there are so many questions, moral questions, legal questions, political questions, military questions, related to the fight against terrorism, that it simply blows your mind. Are there any partners that the United States has or may have in future in the fight against terrorism? Yeah. Well, of course, Western democracies are natural partner. But you will probably be surprised to learn that Saudi Arabia contributed money to create an anti-terrorism center in the United Nations. Saudi Arabia. Were they honest, serious, or they were just trying to do something about the fact that most of the 9/11 terrorists were from Saudi Arabia? That Osama bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia? Again, it's a big question, but should it be explored? Should it be studied? I guess it's an interesting proposition. Well, Russia. Let me tell you, it's not easy to be a Russian right now. Last year was terrible for me and for many of my friends here, and of course, for normal people in Russia. And believe me, there are millions and millions of normal people in Russia. It's not very popular to talk about any cooperation with Russia, but it's imperative for a number of reasons. Number one is geographical position of the country, which is right there, sitting on top of the hotbeds, Middle East, Central Asia, and so on. Russia has capability to participate in the fight against terrorism. Very effective intelligence system. And most important, Russia has political will to cooperate with other countries in fighting terrorism, because the understanding in Russia of what terrorism may mean for Russia, with the multi-ethnic, multi-confessional composition of the country, is very high. And actually Russians have been trying to enlist cooperation with the Western countries and the United States for years and years and years. At some points, there are several examples of very productive cooperation against drug trafficking, human trafficking, and international terrorism. Well, but the most important partner for the United States should be the United Nations. Yes, it's a huge bureaucracy. I spent 21 years in this bureaucracy, so I guess I can say that. It works in what they say is geological time, not internet time. It's very slow. It's very bureaucratized, but still, it's the only universal organization. And especially after 9/11, member states of the United Nations were able to overcome some of their tensions and contradictions. And there is a whole line of international legal instruments, agreements, declarations that, as I mentioned previously, condemn terrorism wherever, whoever does it, in whatever shape or form. And this is very important. But even more important are very concrete, down-to-earth things that the United Nations has been doing over these years. The United Nations cannot actually fight terrorism in operational sense. It doesn't have an army. doesn't have intelligence. But what the United Nations can do and does and have been doing for all these years is to create a foundation, legal foundation, political foundation for individual countries and groups of countries to actually do fight terrorists on the ground. The whole line of international legal instruments have been adopted in the United Nations. And there are several resolutions of the Security Council which have enforceable obligations embedded into them. You know, the declarations of the General Assembly are not obligatory, not mandatory for any member state. They're declarations of, like, a sense of the Senate in the United States. But what the Security Council decides is obligatory, mandatory for member states. In particular, when it is done under the 7th chapter of the United Nations Charter, which includes provisions for enforcement action, sanctions. And sanctions can be very, very effective in trying to influence governments of some countries to change the course of their policies. It takes time, but it is important. United Nations have developed and concluded a number of very concrete, detailed legal documents to protect civil aviation, maritime traffic. Just one example. There is an agreement that plastic explosives have to be marked as explosives, because otherwise you cannot detect them when you see them. And whatever is not marked should be used or destroyed. Just one example. And that was an agreement which was developed and signed by the United Nations members. Coordination of travel, visa policies, exchange of information, exchange of customs information, permits to monitor traffic of people and goods that may be dangerous, like containers that are coming to American ports every day. Financing of terrorism. Again, there are United Nations instruments that but complicate significantly the ways terrorists can launder money, get money from drug trafficking, human trafficking, and so on. United Nations was trying very hard to establish some sort of interaction between civilizations. Mainly, of course, it's the Islamic world and the Western world. There is a so-called Alliance of Civilizations, which is co-chaired by Turkey and Spain, and they have big meetings and they have discussions, and that's also very important, but of course it's not going to change the course of this whole thing. I'm coming close to the end of my allotted time, and I'll mention just one more thing in what United Nations is doing. It is assisting states that cannot themselves do anything to combat terrorism on their territories, mainly developing states. And the United Nations is sharing information, training people to be able to participate in the fight against terrorism, and that also is very, very important. Again, the principal thrust of what I'm trying to communicate, to share with you, is that it's a global challenge. It needs to be global in response, and I hope our discussion today will identify some areas where we should have more global concerted action more comprehensive action, more coherent action. Thank you very much.
We may just speak right from the tables. I think those microphones might be able to. So are they on? Do they work?
Okay, I guess it's my turn then. Just to remind you of the question that we're answering today is how can the United States work with the UN and its allies to prevent and combat terrorism? I, along with my other fellow classmates here, are going to share with you their topic of interest. I was able to narrow down my search and follow the topic of recruitment of women in terrorism because I'm most interested in women's ideals and how they come about with their decisions. Here we go. It seems bizarre that women would want to join a group that plainly oppresses them. An example of what ISIS has resorted to is using kittens to lure women into joining their group. It has been shown that women join terror groups with similar reasons to men, not as a way to degrade their gender. It stems from lack of education, family neglect, and religious reasoning. Behind being in a terrorist group, women fear for their lives every single day, the fear of rape and brutality. I question why any woman would consider joining a group in which their own gender is discriminated against. In order to prevent any further recruitment, we need to ensure the safety of all women in terrorist regions. Declaring their safety will give them a sense of stability. Without their safety in this region, they feel they have no other protection than to join a radical group. They are lost with no identities and no other way of defining themselves. The fear of tearing down these women need to be eliminated. They need to be heard by the world. If they are continually ignored by the world around them, then who is there to be their listeners? A well-perceived writer of foreign affairs, Nimi Garanathan, gave his opinion of the subject. Peacekeeping initiatives often lead women out of strategic discussions, regulating them to tasks explicitly concerning women's rights. The approach is unsustainable. In the end, peace is built through the inclusion of diverse perspectives, and so long as gendered assumptions persist, female voices will go unheard. Women fight for personal as well as political power, often sacrificing one for the other. If the world ignores that fact, it will miss a chance to deal with the identity politics that sustain war. They want to hide themselves from the torturous actions put in place by groups such as ISIS, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab. The terror groups have been said to have cut open women's stomachs and buried children alive. So why would any woman feel safer as the victim of this violence when they could be safer as the initiator? The United States should work together with its allies in an effort to provide a safer environment to the women at stake with their own. Many women today have turned to social media as a way of self-promotion. The female recruiters have been known to post images on Twitter and Instagram showing them enjoying milkshakes and this so-called freedom. What they neglect to show are the terror acts caused by several of them, leaving thousands killed. It is this propaganda that has convinced women that joining terror groups will better their lives. Mia Bloom, a professor at the Center for Terrorism and Security Studies at UMass, claims most of the girls are drawn by a combination of fantasy and the feeling that by joining ISIS they will be empowered, have an exciting life, and do something meaningful with their lives. There needs to be an end to this unsecure lifestyle. Women need to be heard. It is from my understanding that if a woman is given the opportunity to speak their mind, they will do so as a way of seeking for help. Gary Nathan goes on to say, when women are unable to air their grievances publicly and non-violently, extremism becomes more tempting. Without a voice, the female population is left with no other choice than to suffer in the dark. It then becomes important for women to join in the fight to end terrorism. From my own experiences working in the UN, I noticed the lack of women engaged in negotiations revolving their own safety around the world. A woman from South Sudan spoke in the Security Council, encouraging females to join the political workforce. South Sudan's population in particular lacks the female leaders necessary to create equal rights as well as a safer environment to all. Peacekeeping initiatives often lead women out of strategic discussions. A female perspective will give the issue more of a balance of power.
Can you just push those things a little closer? Might pick up the voice.
All right, that's my name, Martin Meyer, and I'm going to be looking at the psychology of a terrorist. mainly the individual, to promote a solution. So we've been faced with an enormous question today. How can the US work with the UN and its allies to combat and prevent terrorism? Often in this question, we have defined terrorism as a normal war, a war on terror. This is perhaps an understandable position, as war is deeply rooted in our human nature and history, a violent platform for evil growth, at least in our perspective, as violence is the most powerful method. Thus, we've responded to terrorism as a normal war, abolishing the reaction with a stronger reaction. We fire rockets, drones, and bullets into the lives of our enemy, suppressing whatever change the evil has been yearning for. We've been doing this for 13 years, at least in the US since 9/11. Iraq has fallen again, the Islamic State continues to grow, and the support of foreign victims slips through our fingers as we tighten our iron grasp. I think peacemaker Jason McHugh put it best when he said the secret to combating terrorism is look at it as a unique cause and effect, an asymmetrical approach. You see, we have evolved as a species to fight bodies with bodies. Never before have we had to battle ideas. One cannot shoot terror, one cannot shoot what made terror emerge. Rather, they identify those roots of terror and deal with the ideals. This is the asymmetrical approach. So, what are the roots of terror? Well, for one, they're not simply evil. As son of a terrorist, Zach Abram explains, there's not 500,000 psychopaths. Although terrorist leaders themselves are interested in the malicious prospects of the apocalypse, unified extremist beliefs, and eliminating the infidels, rarely do their followers actually join for these prospects. Here's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. According to The Atlantic, 90% of people who join terrorist groups lack right here in the safety section. They're impoverished, they lack food and shelter, and most of all, they're afraid. Mostly because maybe they're in the waiting for a job, maybe they have a weak, unlawful political system due to their country, maybe they have a loss of power, or maybe they have a general contradiction with the way the world is run. Powerless and unsafe, the psychological ideals of terrorist leaders become incredibly enticing despite their moral implications. A terrorist leader offers safety, violence, and power. By becoming fear, one is no longer afraid. They offer vengeance on the West, vengeance for a position more followers find themselves in. For every bomb and bullet launched is more evidence of the suffering, the need for the change to become away from this need. A suicide bomber's body represents to him his propaganda, his ability to influence this far more connected world. And finally, terrorist leaders offer an alleviation of the pain of life through the inception that death is far greater, that by joining this organization, whatever tyrannies bestowed upon in this life are insignificant in the immortal existence. All of this if you join the terrorist group. As Dr. Grabowski, a psychologist at Harvard University, says, the moral values of others are second to one's own. This seems obvious, but this is how terrorists rationalize their actions. Not because they're psychopaths, but because they've stopped judging others' lives, because their lives suddenly appear so terrible. And as Dr. Kambeloff said, the quote, terribleness depends from person to person. But these terrorist extremists are offering the best solution. They must be the underdogs, lest their actions will become unnecessary. The more bombs we send, the stronger the fear grows, the greater the vengeance becomes, the more terrorists we see. It becomes a vicious cycle that the US and UN are feeding. As peacemaker Jason McHugh says, it's possible to assume that a change is a necessary reaction, and it's only being expressed in this violent form, as we see with terrorists today. So then, what's the solution? Right now, terrorists call themselves freedom fighters, and as to their perspective, they are. They're attempting to enact change to free themselves from their oppression in a recognizable worldly way. What the UN must do is turn the tables. Instead of fighting violence with violence, how about
doing absolutely nothing in response to the terrorists, giving these freedom fighters the opportunity to look in the mirror and view their oppressions for their moral values. Then, instead of giving death, perhaps give breath. Maybe allow for that economic or political change that terrorists have been yearning for. Kill the idea that they must become the horror by decreasing, not increasing, the horror itself. Suddenly, the Islamic State will run dry, as this change will occur. The United Nations has been offering a better solution from these terrorist groups if they enact this set of ideals. Not oppressing the change, but enabling it through good moral principles, uprooting terrorism. So perhaps the UN has to borrow a page from Gandhi, where ideas fought ideas in a war he knew he could never win. After all, this has been applied in small proportions, providing incredible results. Jason McHugh notes a scenario in which a terrorist bombing at a peace protest in which no one fought back. There has never been a bombing there again, despite more protests. As much as vengeance is built into our nature, we must resist. We must end this cycle. For only death's immortality could change life's morals. At least, that's how it once was.
Hello, I am Bianca Getzel. I will also be tackling the question of how can the U.S. and the UN and its allies work to prevent and combat terrorism. And I'll be focusing on how improving economic opportunities in terrorist-hosting countries might improve the situation. On February 17th, Mary Harf, a State Department spokeswoman, in a series of TV interviews explained what she believed would be the most comprehensive approach to combating terrorism. She tried to explain how the root of the problem was lack in economic opportunities, and increasing the amount of jobs in terrorist-hosting countries could decrease the amount of people who end up joining these organizations in the long run. She claims we cannot win this war by killing them. We need to go after the root causes that leads people to join these groups, for instance, the lack of opportunity for jobs. If a country provides hope for people who are on the verge of joining these groups through jobs, then these people will not have the desire to partake in these endeavors. Harf's argument, however, was abruptly cut off by several political figures, most notably by Fox News host Chris Matthews, who argued that poverty cannot be stopped, which is a very hopeless message. Instead of bashing her argument that improving economic opportunity can prevent and combat terrorism, we should analyze its validity in hopes to end this war on terror. Having the U.S. invest in foreign aid to attempt and improve financial prospect in terrorist-holding countries is an idea that has been introduced before and is not unheard of, but it has always been left aside, especially in the U.S., who has most often had a military approach to combat terrorism. In former President Bush's 2006 State of the Union address, he also discussed how providing hope for these people, terrorists, might very well decrease the likelihood of these groups expanding. He is explaining how hope can end terrorism. And with that, Bush was also implying that improving job opportunities in those countries can have its benefits in officially fighting and stopping the war on terror. So one can see how this issue has not only come to light through the Democratic Party, Republicans have also touched upon the issue. And there's a reason for that, considering these remarks are valid. If one looks at a map showcasing the amount of people in each country who are joining terrorist groups, one sees a pattern. It is the economically unstable countries who have the highest numbers. Muhammad Ali, a human rights advocate, enlightens the link between unemployment and terrorism. Like many before him, Ali explains how many people in countries like Somalia, or generally not financially stable, go through a period known as waithood. This is the time period after people have concluded their education and are stuck in their country waiting to find a job. And the first opportunity that is introduced to them is that to join a terrorist organization. So if one provides an alternate opportunity, like that to have a job, then people in these developing countries will not turn to their last resort, which is terrorism. One might argue that one of the biggest figures in an overpowering terrorist organization, ISIS, is Jihadi John, who originated from a well-off middle-class family in London. However, if one tracks his story, they note how originally he was offered an opportunity to work in a computer company. but the UK prohibited him from leaving London to go pursue his job and marriage in Kuwait. And it is after he was prohibited from having a job that he began to truly rebel and join Al-Shabaab, a terrorist group affiliated with Al-Qaeda. At the surface, it looks as if he was always financially stable and had a career path. But even a main player of this organization, it is when he was stripped of a job opportunity that he turned to terrorism. But it's not the leaders who truly build and make up terrorist organizations. We will not be able to prevent strong-minded extremist individuals with just a job. But we can't stop the masses of people, the followers, who are simply joining terrorist groups because they have no other purpose. But by giving them a job, we are giving them a purpose, and debatably a reason not to die. In the past, the US has often tried to combat the war on terror by using its forceful military, and invest endless amount of money in doing that. So if we are considering this idea of a strong military force to combat terrorism so strongly, maybe it is time to look into considering other tactics to ending this war just as emphatically. And this is where job opportunity comes in. If we start to invest money in helping countries who have very few job opportunities, we might stunt the growth of these terrorist organizations. Currently, in a terrorist hosting country, US typically only invests 0.8% of its foreign aid money to that country to economic assistance. The US hasn't been the only one to underestimate the issue, however. The UN has handled it similarly, considering whilst drafting resolutions to prevent and combat terrorism, it has only included powerless and unfunded subclauses saying that economic opportunity should be improved. If we boost job possibilities, we can prevent new terrorists from joining groups, all the while preventing future organizations, and improving economic stability within the country. The UN should also work on a more international scale with the US to draft a resolution where the United Nations begins to invest in the same thing. So if the US and the UN could work together to provide hope for soon-to-be terrorists by providing foreign aid money so they can have a job, that could improve the situation. We cannot end this war by just killing them. If we tackle the problem at its root, the chances of it expanding will diminish. We provide hope and a chance for financially stable life. People will no longer see terrorism as their only option. If introduced with an opportunity, then morally people will seize it. Thank you.
Hello, I am Sebastian Taylor, and I will be addressing the question from the stance of demilitarization. Guns. Guns dominate our world. President Obama declared in his State of the Union speech, "We lead best when we combine military power with strong diplomacy, when we leverage our power with coalition building, when we don't let our fears blind us to the opportunities that this new century presents." However, sole dependence on diplomacy is a very foreign concept in our society. Perhaps our reliance on standing armies and application of force in foreign affairs has, at least in part, exacerbated the rise of the dangerous non-state actor. I propose that the US and other world powers, like China and Russia, take steps to demilitarize and disarm to contribute to an atmosphere of peace and cohabitation. As of 2015, there are at least 15 countries with no military forces. Another 6 possess no standing armies and only limited military forces. Admittedly, many of these countries are small, remote islands relying on protective agreements with larger military powers. Consequently, applying total demilitarization to the US would be impossible at this point. Journalist Joel Laporte claimed that the US perspective on building a defense budget is captivated by the idea that the manifest destiny of the United States is to patrol the world. 6 decades after VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, nearly 300,000 American troops are stationed overseas, including 55,000 in Germany, 35,000 in Japan, and 10,000 in Italy. The United States defense budget for the fiscal year 2015 is projected at $495.6 billion. In the past, this has composed 20% of the total US budget. Perhaps this emphasis on the modern military is a contributor to the rise of tensions between state and non-state actors. Perhaps it is time to reduce the US's role as an aggressive world military power. In addition, there is an abundance of accessible arms in today's society. According to the Government Accountability Office, between February 2004 and December 2014, there have been 2,333 cases of individuals on the terror watch list attempting to purchase firearms and explosives. 90% of the time, these individuals have passed the background checks and been granted approval to buy the arms. On March 4th, photos of the Syrian Nusra Front showed the terrorist organization controlling a vast array of US weapons. These weapons have been provided to the Harakat Hazm, a moderate Syrian rebel group, and when the group lost Base 46, the weapons fell into the hands of the Nusra Front. This isn't the first time the US has indirectly armed non-state actors either. Similar circumstances followed the Cold War with Saddam Hussein. So how can the US and the UN counteract terrorism with this in mind? There are already UN institutions in place, such as the Peace Corps and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, with the purpose of providing protection and destroying dilatory weaponry. The OPCW was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize in 2013 for its contributions to destroying a portion of Syria's chemical weapons. This consisted of safely transporting weapons of mass destruction to fixed and portable destruction stations dependent on hydrolysis and neutralizing agents. What if more emphasis was placed on the UN non-violent institutions, rather than on individual contributions of force by countries like the US? In 1922, Mahatma Gandhi coined the term Shanti Sena. The Shanti Sena was a peace army, a collection of conscientious participants who acted as third-party arbitrators between hostile factions, in this case between the Hindu and Muslim communities. I propose that the UN focuses on using its Peace Corps as arbitrators in unstable communities. Thus, as conflict between Sufis and Sunnis mounted, a third party, composed heterogeneously of different nationalities, could relay information between the two sides, prompt compromise, and protect groups under persecution with non-violent acts. This was an effective method for India in 1962. This would mean, though, that the emphasis on military world powers would diminish. Instead of standing armies working unilaterally to combat terrorist organizations and potentially exacerbate the violence, countries would contribute to the International Peace Corps, which would function as moderator in unstable parts of the world. Perhaps the US should look to precedents like Japan's Article 9, in which the country agrees to demobilize the standing army, renounce any war-making, and maintain a military force for self-defense. In the end, it is vital, too, that the organizations like the OPCW continue to destroy chemical weapons and chemical and nuclear weapons to create a shift from a world recognition of hard power to a world culture of soft power and diplomacy. Thank you.
I'm Jim Hagan, and I focus on crime and corruption and its role in terrorism. The Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, aka the Ukrainian rebels, at this point in time find themselves well within the classification of terrorists. The Ukrainian government in Kiev classified them as such last spring, and the EU recently included that classification in a new vote of sanctions imposed on the rebels. The evidence brought up most recently has been the shelling of Mariupol, aimed at civilian areas. The militants initially blamed the attack on Kiev, or the West, but Alexander Zakharchenko, head of the Donetsk People's Republic group, took credit for the attack on January 24th. Additionally, the involvement of Russia has been overwhelmingly evident in this conflict. Despite the Kremlin's denial of involvement, the presence of Russian troops and arms was as clear last spring as it is now. Putin's even gone so far as to urge the Ukrainians to surrender, stating, "I hope that the responsible figures in the Ukrainian leadership will not hinder soldiers in the Ukrainian army from putting down their weapons." It's clear Russia has violated Ukraine's sovereignty, and as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe stated, the Russian Federation has, since February 2014, violated every one of the 10 Helsinki principles in its relations with Ukraine. In response, the US, UN, EU have imposed primarily economic sanctions on Russia and specific individuals and corporations involved. They have certainly had a strong effect on the Russian economy, but the question posited today is not what have we done, but what further can we do to prevent and combat this instance of terrorism in the Ukraine. Within this prompt, we are inevitably faced with separating terrorism from patriotism. After all, the key idea in organized terrorism is most commonly national liberation. In order to decide, however, whether that nationalism is just, one must examine the situation and motivations from which this conflict arose. It began with Ukrainian President Yanukovych deciding in 2014 to reject an EU loan in exchange for a Russian loan. In the Western Ukrainians' view, Yanukovych's, in essence, this decision shows further ties with Russia over new connections with the EU. In the Western Ukrainians' view, Yanukovych's exceedingly corrupt regime was being safeguarded by Putin's even more corrupt regime. Yanukovych was ousted, and the fighting began. The West representing the established Ukrainian government, and the East backed by Russia. Putin certainly has a vested interest within this conflict. One of those is that Putin is protecting the reputation and safety of his mafia state, as the US diplomats addressed it in 2010. As George Ortung, a GWU professor, stated on NPR, the Ukrainians, through the Maidan Revolution just about a year ago, were very interested in getting rid of this system of corruption and organized crime. Putin became afraid that something similar might happen in Russia. He did not want to see a democracy appear in Ukraine that would serve as a model for Russian citizens. So it is absolutely within his interest to destabilize and discredit a revolution centered on expunging corruption. A culture of corruption and organized crime destabilized Ukraine. The current state of terrorism within the Ukraine is thus a partial result of corruption. A culture of corruption and organized crime destabilized the Ukraine in the first place, and protection of organized crime played a role in Putin's exacerbation of the conflict. As a result, the US and UN must attack this instance of terrorism much differently than those of Islamic extremism. The target here is not a warped religious interpretation, but corruption. Our economic sanctions have gone quite a ways towards this end. After all, a mafia state deteriorates without income, and the sanctions are even indicative of anti-corruption sentiments, often targeting loyal individuals central to Putin's absolute control. And while economic sanctions are undoubtedly effective towards targeting this culture of corruption, they also have tangible and unjustified impacts on innocent Russian civilians. The next step for the US, UN, and their allies is to focus their efforts more closely on combating corruption. Ultimately, we all stand to benefit from ending corruption abroad. A corrupt government serves itself and not the people. Yet the ultimate purpose of any government ought to be to provide for its people. Corruption detracts from a government's ability to ensure its people's safety, protect their livelihoods, and create a progressive and modern international society. It flies in the face of ideals like equality, integrity, and the rule of law, and even past resolving the Ukrainian conflict, its elimination ought to be a priority in the eyes of the international community. Intensifying our focus on the Ukrainian and Russian corruption would be a first step towards combating this instance of terrorism, but when we truly focus on eliminating corruption abroad, we prevent a situation like this from happening ever again. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption in 2003 took major steps towards fighting corruption, necessitating key factors like transparency and the illegalization of various corrupt actions. Russia is actually hosting this convention this November, but Russia still has not illegalized illicit enrichment or shown any efforts to enforce other key aspects of the UNCAC's resolution. If we were to bargain the gradual removal of our economic sanctions for evidence of concrete actions against corruption within the Russian government alongside our other goals, we'd be shifting the international community's discipline away from the innocent Russian citizens and onto the corrupt institutions that propagated this conflict in the first place. By renewing our efforts to fight corruption, we strike at the core issue in this conflict. Putin has sent a message of hopelessness to the world, that to overthrow the corrupt can only lead to chaos. It's a dangerous ideology, it preaches acquiescence and submission. It's backwards and wholly unjust. Yet the only way we can fight it is by committing ourselves to ending corruption.
I'm Drew Miller, and I focus on the different affiliations with Al-Qaeda that we don't hear much about, and that we often forget. The United States, as well as many other countries around the world, have been battling against complications of extremism and religious inequality for years. Rula Jibril, a journalist, novelist, and commentator for MSNBC, stated on a recent episode of Global Public Square that terrorism is designed to induce fear. Our perseverance to stand up to the fear has been strongly driven by bravery and the impossible thought of allowing the radical destruction of terrorist groups to defeat us. Osama bin Laden and Abdul Azim created the main terrorist group of Al-Qaeda in the late 1990s. We are all well aware of their intentions and their locations and their plans for years, but that's the problem. We're unaware of the 6 regional branches and at least 14 other affiliations the Central Terrorist Group requires as of 2011. As a whole, the organizations have operations in almost 30 countries, as you can see up there, including Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Malaysia, and then a few others to mention, Somalia, Yemen, and Nigeria. As our home-based countries continue to prevent and combat terrorism, there are important factors to remember. By working not only with the UN, but also our allies, we must begin to develop the strategies on how to further investigate the affiliations that we don't hear much about, that are not mentioned by CNN, and that are not on newspaper headlines around the world in various languages. There are many affiliations tied with Al-Qaeda, and although the groups have different goals, each one of them still actively pursues Al-Qaeda's agenda. Many aspects drive these affiliations to achieve their goals. It's hard to imagine it, but years ago, ISIS was once a terrorist group that we didn't know too much about. Eventually, they expanded and branched into the radical group we hear day in and day out on the news. I'm sorry, I read that line. Whoops. Boko Haram has recently been featured in the news for killing dozens in a raid in a Nigerian village, placing harm and destruction on the innocent civilians. The group has political aspirations in their base in Nigeria, and as Africa's most populous nation, this illuminates a territory to be considered a political and economic powerhouse for the continent. Al-Shabaab is another terrorist group to shift our focus towards. The group is stationed mostly in southern and central Somalia, as you can see up there, one of the most impoverished countries in the world, where a number of radical Islamist groups come and go as its decades-long turmoil continues. The country can be best described as having pockets of power spread across the territory, so Al-Shabaab strives to take control of that power and become the ultimate powerhouse group. Their military strength is approximately 5,000 fighters, as it has preserved the core of its fighting force, according to the July UN report. In the hopes of preventing another disaster such as ISIS, more resources, as well as military forces, from the U.S. are essential in the fight to keep Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab in their place. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says military pressure must be necessary. Ultimately, a combination of diplomacy and pressure will be needed to bring about a political transition. I view this issue as a problem with many strategies and factors involved. It's not an us versus them situation, but instead we must form a coalition, a team, to expand our ability. The affiliations still consider themselves at war with the U.S., the Western nations, and their own governments. And to declare the war on terrorism as ceased would be a great thought. However, this fight won't rest until we dominate the fear that they display, no matter how long it takes. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Stephen Williams, and the topic I looked at is promoting pluralism in the Middle East. The inability for different sects to coexist has plagued the Islamic community for centuries in the Middle East. Bad blood and an endless cycle of revenge between Sunni Shiite and minority Muslims has led to a hotbed for terrorist groups to surface. The lack of pluralism has often bled into the political systems, causing economic and civil chaos in countries such as Iraq and Syria. For example, when Maliki came to power in Iraq, he immediately oppressed the Sunni population to seek revenge for his Shiites. The youth in the Middle East are tired of these oppressing conditions and economic hardships. It's very easy to see how the struggling political systems have forced their people to have such little hope. They rather join a group like ISIS than to continue suffering in these conditions. America has long pushed for Islamic states to adapt democratic political systems in the Middle East without looking at the fundamental issues that would not allow these to work. Democracy only thrives when all parties can openly discuss topics and accept differing viewpoints. Unfortunately, the dangerous precedent set by many Middle Eastern political systems promotes the exact opposite. However, stamping the countries with an I voted sticker is not nearly enough. Democracy involves more than an election. If democracy is the answer for how to achieve pluralism in the Middle East, then we must strive to bring the highest standard of democracy to that region. The United States and its allies need to work on promoting systems of government that ensure a voice for the many different groups present in the region. One of the best ways of doing this is to work on adopting a proportional democratic system in which the number of seats in the government available for the different religious or political groups will be determined by their percentage of the population. This system would allow room for all opinions to be heard. The United States can aid by creating a summit with the UN member countries to help these developing governments establish a constitutional convention in which the member states can advise those working on forming a new system of government for their country. To prevent these conditions that lead a suffering youth to terrorist organizations, the U.S. should push to improve education in the Middle East. If we can teach the younger population of the region to accept differing viewpoints on topics and how to civilly solve issues, we can one day hope to see a democratic government in the Middle East that are free from corruption and oppression. The Arab world today needs an education system that develops a strong value system, encourages critical and constructive thinking, and teaches the importance of tolerating and accepting various viewpoints, wrote former Jordanian Deputy Prime Minister Marwan Mashar in his book, The Second Arab Awakening. The U.S. should work with its allies to construct an educational and political system that will lead the Middle East out of its downward spiral. Different sects of Muslims being able to accept one another will play a key role for them if they wish to provide a society that does not allow terrorist organizations to gain traction. It would be in the world's best interest to promote pluralism in the Middle East because it would provide better living conditions throughout the region. If the different sects of the religion were able to coexist in society, they would work past their previous issues to create an environment that would not allow for terrorism to be spread. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Christine Klein, and I'm going to be looking at the question with regards to freedom of speech and the media. Terrorist groups, namely ISIS, are using every possible mode of contemporary messaging to recruit fighters, intimidate enemies, and promote their claims worldwide. The New York Times contends the group's heavy media presence is because of their adeptness at targeting the young audience. ISIS uses internet sites such as Twitter, SoundCloud, JustPaste, WhatsApp, AskFM, and many, many more to disseminate their messages and claims globally. It is being called the evolution of modern jihadist propaganda, and that's exactly what it is, propaganda. Stopping extremist organizations has proven to be a messy situation with regards to the First Amendment. Many would argue that disallowing organizations to publish and produce their content is ridding citizens of their natural right to freedom of speech. This has initiated a global debate among the United States, its allies, and large media companies like Twitter. Take the January 7th terrorist attacks in Paris, France, at the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, for instance. The magazine was targeted after publishing a controversial cover satirizing the Prophet Muhammad. After the attack, Patrick Pillow, a former Charlie Hebdo columnist, said, "We, as in Charlie Hebdo, must become a global newspaper of freedom." Almost overnight, the phrase, "Just Sweet Charlie," sent a message of free speech and resilience around the world. The Muslim world responded to that phrase by dubbing their own version, "Je ne suis pas Charlie," which translates to, "I am not Charlie." In the wake of this atrocity and the dozens of beheadings of international journalists, the U.S. and its allies need to be cognizant of freedom of speech. It is clear that terrorism is often a product of media recruitment. Even though the media is so large, there must be some way to reverse the vicious cycle. Many ask why the government doesn't just work to shut down sites like Twitter. Clint Watts, a former FBI agent, responded to that question in an NPR interview. He said it's very tough because who's to say one person's thoughts or ideas should render them thrown off the platform versus another? The situation is difficult, but in this case, terrorists' thoughts should be thrown off the platform, and as a result, it may be necessary to nullify some of our personal freedoms, which sounds like the Patriot Act, a bill that allows surveillance of citizens without a sufficient checks and balances system. Intelligence services do have the ability to banish terrorist media accounts, but the situation is more convoluted than that because intelligence services need the sites which provide a window into the terrorists' world. I believe the same as Texas Representative Ted Poe, that we should not be giving free rein to terrorists to use American companies to spread their message of hate and violence at will. A foreign policy article said, First Amendment activists will almost certainly cry foul. This is why it is important for the government to take a step back. Terrorists and others will argue that by condemning free speech, we aren't standing up for the democracy we always preach. This is why I see this not as an issue totally under government control. Instead, regulation should be based off of media companies' dialogue with other organizations. I see the beginning of this regulation in Twitter's terms and conditions, which say one can't use the site if they are barred from receiving services under the laws of the United States or other applicable jurisdiction. Terrorists qualify as those excluded from receiving U.S. services. It needs to be identified what qualifies as stepping outside of boundaries. In my opinion, extremist acts qualify as entering that outside limit. On the surface, dialogue appears useful, but can only work if sites like Twitter are willing to work, which at the moment they're not. I believe the fight for terrorism isn't just a conflict that should be fought on the ground. Thanks to the media, we're fighting terrorism on our turf too. The United States and allies such as France should continue creating campaigns that monitor extremist communication, like the phrase, #ThinkAgain, Turn Away, which was aimed at those considering joining groups. The recent terrorism summit at the White House came up with interesting propositions to further plans on the media's influence. By taking a multilateralist approach, the U.S. and private sector can generate global strategies that develop digital content that discredits violent extremism. Freedom of speech is often thought to be a government issue, but when national security is on the line, it's okay for it to be disregarded. Digital content of the U.S. juxtaposed with that of terrorist groups, along with an increased cooperation between all the involved parties, is how the public can be persuaded against extremism, which would also in turn combat it.
So at this point, we'll really open the floor up to the audience, to the panelists, to ask each other questions, to have your tabletop questions. I don't really know where, if we want to start with the panelists or with the audience, but really if anyone wants to begin, that would be great from either forum. Nice job there.
Okay, I guess I'll start. Going off of what you were saying, you asked the question, can torture be justified, especially if one man tortures in order to save thousands of lives? Well, after listening to what you two had to say, I got the idea of how, where you were going off of people just ignoring terrorism almost, not completely, but going a different route as far as helping them politically and economically, hoping that that'll end it, because basically what terrorists want and what their goals are and their aims is to promote terror. They want everyone to be scared. But if we act as if we aren't scared, I feel as though that'll push them further away and say that, wow, nothing's actually happening here. And off of what Bianca was saying, how we need an alternative to joining a terrorist group to prevent any further terrorists from joining these groups, get jobs and give them an education. So I just like those ideas and thought I'd share that.
I really liked your list of conditions for what causes terrorism. You cited like prolonged conflict and ethnic differences in that list. Do you think that applies to the Ukrainian rebels?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with you that rebels or separatists can be classified as terrorists. Yes, Ukrainian government did call them terrorists, but you have to do certain things. You have to deliberately target civilians and non-combatants to satisfy the condition for being a terrorist. I don't think that separatists in Ukraine as a whole, I'm not talking about individuals, as a whole satisfy this condition. And therefore I would not buy the notion that they are terrorists. We can talk a long time about what happened there, and you did very good research, and I probably don't agree with any of the statements that you say, but I have to admit, and it applies to all of you. I'm, again, very much impressed by the quality of preparation and insight and dedication. One thing I should warn you about is that some of you used quotes from Foreign Policy, New York Times, and so on. For every quote, you can find hundreds of quotes saying exactly the opposite. So please, in your future research, do not be excited or happy when you found exactly the quote that you agree with totally. It may or may not be describing this as a real situation.
I did warn Jim that disagreement was going to happen.
I was well prepared for it.
I was well prepared for that. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Oh, I was going to ask, going off of that same question, the idea of youth in the U.S. and other European countries who have been enticed to join ISIS. How do you think that reacts with the conditions that were set by the UN when we see rises in terrorism with prolonged unresolved conflicts and lack of rule of law? These people don't necessarily fall into the conditions that we've created. So do you have any ideas on what conditions they are in this new circumstance?
That's exactly the question that I tried to address to you. Because I cannot understand why 15, 16-year-olds born in the United Kingdom, going to school in the United Kingdom, having no discrimination, well, you can always find discrimination, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, all this. But the girls that I saw photos, they're on hijabs. Nobody forces them to go to school without hijab. It's not France. From well-to-do families with bright prospects. What made them these three, which is an epitome of what is happening? What made them do this? And I certainly cannot understand the mentality of a more than 16-year-old person. I thought that you would be able to educate me on this. And you're asking me this question. I don't know.
I think I've got two guesses. I'm not going to say there's solid answers, but the prospect of a terrorist group and the ideals of having this power over individuals. And when you grow up in these societies where you can climb the ladder, in the United Kingdom, the U.S., and you're a youth, and that's the top, right? Sometimes that is so daunting and terrifying that perhaps the easiest route is through violence. The easiest route to control, because that's what the terrorist groups are propagating here. They have control. Right. Perhaps the greatest route to it, and the easiest route appears to be through this violence, this terror, to be recognized among such a society of sort of capitalistic ideas.
If I may, can I refer to what you said about why would a woman join a group that denies women recognition as humans, basically? ISIS assigns young girls, women, to marriages. So these three young girls, 16-year-old, 15-year-old, run the risk of being given as wife to somebody who they never met and so on. Still, they go there. Yes, I understand that some individuals may have, remember this triangle of aspirations, to have power over others, yes. I didn't have an impression that these three girls were kind of oppressed, haunted by perspective of living in the United Kingdom. They wanted something else, something different. Is it power? Is it just trying to experience everything? I'll try anything once. Yeah. Well, we don't know. So until we have a clear understanding of what is happening, why people in the United States, and not only Muslims, why people in France, in the United Kingdom, why do they go there? Why people convert to Islam to begin with? Until we understand this, it will be very difficult for us to effectively counteract this.
I wonder if, Christine, I wonder if part of it is an identification where youth are identifying terrorism with the counterculture, because there is often with youth movements this revolt against the traditional values of the generations before. So perhaps because of so much influence from or access to the propaganda, it's there's a blurring of the lines between what's dangerous and what's simply rebelling against the past generation. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that a lot of the recruitment does happen through the media, and I think that the youth, since we identify and relate to the media, we all use it, and when we see something on the internet that interests us, we kind of pursue it, and kids who were living in Islamic countries and going on it, since they practice Muslim beliefs, that maybe if they see Muslims doing this, that's kind of a stretch. Maybe they don't like the radical ideas necessarily, but they see oh, well, I practice Islamic beliefs. Maybe I should join this. Kind of what I'm saying.
I was going to say a similar thing regarding of how teenagers, young people, they want a voice, they want a purpose. And as Anna was saying before, maybe women see in these terrorist organizations a purpose in their life that they don't have anywhere else. So somewhere where they can share their voice, they can make themselves heard, which maybe in their host countries is diminished, especially for women or the teens and youth in general.
The media definitely gives them a platform to do it because it's so easy, and all youth use it.
Then again, going off of the media, who are the people initiating this propaganda to begin with? Obviously, they have a certain mentality that says, oh, let's, in my statement or whatever, I said how women are posting pictures to Twitter and Instagram with milkshakes saying, oh, this is such a great time, when it's not. You're killing people and it's not right. So, the mentality of those women who are already in the terror groups causing this, what's going through their head to promote something like that?
Yeah, questions to each other? Comments?
I was going to ask you something. You said and how we should give essentially give more people in terrorist hosting countries, terrorists included, religious extremists included, a seat in government positions. But if we see them shutting people up, I guess you could say, or making them not want their voices to be heard, just as of right now and what we have given them, I guess, or just them being right now, if we put them into a government, into our democracy, what will happen if we put a terrorist or someone with such extremist ideals? What will happen when we put them in a democracy? Will they just shut everyone else up? Will they make it less of a democracy?
Well, the main reason I say we need to bring democracy to the Middle East is when people don't have a voice, that's when you tend to see the revolts, or when people don't have the voice and they feel they can't make a difference. It's that feeling that will lead them to go join a terrorist group. So, even if we just offer them the seat in the government, it will probably diminish that feeling they have of hopelessness, not having a say, and it won't lead them to the group.
Yes, but the people that we would be placing into the government would be the leaders of these groups. I suppose that they would like the.
I don't think we necessarily are placing them.
No, we're not.
We're just guaranteeing them seats for election.
And it's proportional to their size. So.
Okay.
I think the way it works in Iran is that a certain percentage of Christians get that certain percentage of seats in the House.
I was just raising the hypothetical of what would happen if we put such an extremist idea, and of course it will obviously be out of election. But, yeah.
Well, I think there would be some hope that if you facilitate equal power for both sides of the argument, there would be a what's it called, a gridlock. But that gridlock would require compromise as the government starts to fail. Kind of how we have Republicans and Democrats and split the power between the two. There was a study, a Terence Leon study about post-conflict elections and the process of demilitarizing politics. Mm-hmm. And essentially it said after a civil war, it's really important that you take both factions of the war and make it more agreeable for them to become political parties than resort back to violence. And having both of them represented in the interim government.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, we have someone in the audience.
I just want to address you, Bianca, and the whole panel. Have you thought about Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland? Jerry Adams was the leader of the IRA. Through negotiation, long time of unsettled war and everything else, he ended up being in the government of Northern Ireland. So it does work. That's it does work. So it's a very good point you raised. So kick back.
May I add? Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, or considered a terrorist. Yasser Arafat was certainly a terrorist. Examples. So, in some cases it works.
Someone recently said to me that revolution is the child of poverty, and I was thinking about how, from a sociological perspective, when we think about gangs, the parallel between terrorists and gang activity and how it's related to social disorganization in communities. And I think it kind of goes back to that whole helping the economy and boosting the economy, and how if we do that, then maybe we can assist terrorists in seeing a different way of life. But it sounds kind of utopian. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
I mean, I don't, now obviously I can't disagree when saying it's a utopian ideal to have like diminish poverty and doing things like that. But obviously, if I was saying with my statement that if we simply boost the economic opportunity that are in those countries, then I was saying the followers, the masses of people might be diminished. For example, where is this? Muhammad Ali, the speaker I was talking about, for example, went in Somalia and put a youth leadership and entrepreneurship summit where he asked 90 young Somali leaders to boost entrepreneurships within their countries. And I mean, obviously it wouldn't have a drastic difference in Somalian terrorism, but at the same time, entrepreneurs are increasing, opportunities are increasing within the countries. Doing tangible things like simply just a summit might increase the opportunities that people have.
Martin, I wanted to ask about your idea. At what point you say that our best response is to do nothing, and I was curious whether you mean to not respond violently, or if we're better off kind of leaving and not like sending the food aid and stuff like that, just being absent in the situation, or...
Yeah, okay, yeah, understandable in the wording, yes. By nothing, I mean not a vengeance act. Like, not if someone shoots your leg, you don't shoot their leg too, which sounds so wrong, but it is a viable solution, I believe.
And would you be, like, within the context of your pitch, would you be in favor of still being present in the regions and providing, like, food and healthcare aid?
Exactly. So it's not providing violence.
Yeah.
Simply providing that. Exactly, yes.
Of the pyramid that you have up there, what would you say is the biggest need that terrorists need to fulfill?
It's from the bottom up, it's the second one.
Safety?
Safety, yeah. Mm-hmm. But the ones that we're talking about, where they're like the 16-year-olds or people like that, it might not be safety. It might be somewhere else on that pyramid, like maybe self-actualization in a society where that becomes very difficult and where there's a counterculture.
Okay, Mother, we'll hear about it later. Go ahead.
When you question, why would 15, 16-year-olds, they're educated, they come from, well-to-do families. What about the ones that have been bullied and didn't fit in? And, you don't know how many people, you're seeing them on the internet just, committing suicide to make their point. What if they don't go down that road and they say, you know what, I'm going to go out, I'm going to learn how to fight, and I'm going to, take it out on people. It's just they've been taunted, and bullying is a big deal, and if they don't fit in, they're going to fit in ISIS.
And to your point, in talking about the young women who become terrorists or suicide bombers, most young women or most women are not serial killers. However, it's typically a man's thing to do. In history, unfortunately, but that young women especially who are on the hierarchy of needs, which I totally see, are many of those women who are stunted at that level of safety are the ones who have been abused, who have been sexually, emotionally, physically abused. And so you could see in a country where they are not given the rights as a normal individual to fight back and then to want to be a terrorist, they now have a name with the men in their country. They have now done a service. They have made a name for themselves, and they have fought back in a way that's accepted by the other terrorists in their country, and anywhere else it wouldn't be accepted.
I'd like to ask a rather sanguine question. Have any of you guys watched the beheading videos? Most sites, how many have you seen? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 6.
Not in depth.
Most of them.
Not in depth, but-
Okay, are you afraid of that?
It's terrifying.
My second question is, considering that they can't hurt you, that shows desperation. So why are you afraid?
I think it's like the very human idea that it could be one of us, and we don't think it's right that it could be any of us, so that we feel we have an obligation to go and stop that from allowing that to be anyone.
You have an obligation?
We feel as if there's something that has to be done, that we can't just sit by because there is a person who says that could be me. And while that's not us in here in Connecticut, we still think that no one should be put in a situation where that could be you.
Could be you in 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, and also, if you think of it through an evolutionary perspective, right? The way human beings came into, well, one, they mastered the tool, but in another aspect, one of the reasons we were so successful as a species was the ability to cooperate. And it's this empathy for other human beings that creates this connection. And when you see someone you don't even know, but are able to connect with them, like with a movie or a story, you don't know these people, but you feel them. And due to that, you must help them. Otherwise, we would have never survived.
And I would like to raise a question too. For example, Italy's main news broadcasting, the TV, the RAI, has recently said that they don't want to showcase any videos of terrorist violence, of beheadings, of things of that nature. And I posed a question, if that choice to not showcase these acts of like very explicit terror is something right for a news broadcast to do when it's, you know, and hypothetically releasing the facts. I'm not saying that I agree with either side, I'm simply posing the question.
I think it's also something really terrifying to think about how if the footage isn't shown, but it's available, how many of us go out searching for that information, and who has access to the information? The internet is so accessible that you could have incredibly young children coming across this information, or people who it's personally, I think it's scary to think about us searching for this horrible information. Not that we should avert our eyes from it, but that we also we have to have a choice between viewing it or not viewing it. And that, I think that's part of my impetus for taking a stance on, we need to decrease the culture of violence. We need to stop this culture that makes us decide, know that the violence is out there, and decide whether we want to see it or just know about it.
I want to go off of that. When I was doing my research, I was kind of on some articles I would read, they would show Twitter posts or posts from some of these other websites that ISIS and other groups use to put out their information. I was just kind of wondering, you know, like when I'm on these sites, like I don't see that stuff, and I don't know if it's like a location thing where it depends on, I guess it depends where you are and who you're friends with, whether or not that you see the information. But then that's kind of why I proposed for my thing that the information should sort of be juxtaposed, like where this bad information is going out, where information to recruit terrorists is going out, the same kind of information should be going out saying don't do terrorism, so that you have like the two things together.
I have a question. When you guys talk about the demilitarization and bringing American troops home from foreign lands, and then you, in the same next context, you talk about jobs and the opportunities for these people in these countries to have jobs. Well, if you drive around this country and you go to a town where they closed a military base, you will find nothing but poverty and basically a ghost town. If you close military bases in Germany and Japan and Korea, like you're talking about, or Saudi Arabia for that matter, the areas around those bases will become ghost towns and high unemployment. What's going to happen then when those people go towards terrorism? Does America left then?
I wonder
you thought about that aspect.
I wonder if perhaps this would not be a permanent solution, but an interim solution would be to convert those bases into, because they are so, and sorry, I don't have the sources to back this up, but because they are to a certain aspect equipped to turn these into living spaces, and also to perhaps provide jobs in demobilization. There is a serious problem. There was an article I found talking about trying to dispose of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials, and the US had contacted, I think it was Finland. And Finland said, we don't have anything to do this with. Why are you contacting us about disposing of these materials? And it's because the sheer quantity we need more ways to dispose of it. And ways to dispose of it that won't harm the environment. So perhaps if we as an interim job, as an interim opportunity for jobs, we employ people in destroying the weapons that were used.
Good questions in the audience. And I have a quick question for you, Dr. Kamoff, really for anyone, you know, in the political gridlock that we have in this country, it seems to have infested every single topic that sometimes aren't even political topics, but we are framed by political guidebooks, it seems like, every 4 years or every 2 years. I wonder what your thoughts, and you can see this as well, our audience members too, how much has that political gridlock maybe prohibited? Has it been prohibited the way we view these terror issues? I know Bianca, you touched on that a little bit. We said, let's stop talking about politics when we talk about this job of economic growth and investment, because Republicans and Democrats have talked about it, yet when one's out of power, they seem to say. So I was just wondering your thoughts, how much of this political gridlock that exists domestically has it been prohibited, do you think, the way we fight this war or combat terrorism?
I wouldn't use the word prohibitive, but I would certainly say that it seriously impedes the effectiveness of this war, and it's my personal opinion is that right now it's rather worrisome and dangerous. For example, question of arming Ukraine to combat terrorists in Ukraine. What does it mean? It's not just you sell modern arms to Ukrainian government. You have to train them. You have to show how to use them, which means US nationals on the ground there. Well, my son is a major in the US Air Force. He is now stationed in Fort Bragg, if any of you know what it means. Obviously, he speaks Russian. So I'm personally very afraid that if it happens, it can lead to, personally for me, some unpleasant things. But more importantly, for this country. If Americans are on the ground, instructors or whatever, doesn't matter. If anything happens to an American or several Americans in Ukraine, what will happen? It's not Somalia when after 18 US troops were killed, US left Somalia and then blocked UN action in Rwanda. Now the situation is different. If anything happens to Americans in Ukraine, Where does it lead to? And why is it related to your question? Because the present administration needs to show its tough. Tough on Russia. 2016 is next year. This is where what you refer to, gridlock, is creating, to my mind, a serious and grave danger.
Well, Mr. Kamalov, what steps do you think, if any, should the U.S. take in the Ukraine?
Say it again.
What steps, if any steps?
Oh, it's too late for any steps. They should have thought about it like 14 months ago. It's too late. It has its own dynamic now, its own inertia, and I'm very pessimistic.
Do you think?
But yes, U.S. has a certain share of blame for the whole tragic, unfortunate situation.
Why?
But that's a totally different story.
Why does U.S. share in blame over there?
Are you prepared to sit here for 2 hours?
Can I maybe give a quick summary?
Huh?
Can I maybe give a quick summary? A quick summary, maybe?
You want to go through?
It's in addition to corruption having a role to play, another part was that Ukraine was trying to move after the Maidan Revolution, where Ukraine had chosen ties with Russia over ties with the EU. The new government was trying to form closer ties with the EU and NATO. So, as one of Russia's historical satellite states and very close allies was moving closer to the West, Russia had a great deal of necessity and motivation to kind of mess that up.
May I just give you one little piece of food for thought? Mexico is also a very corrupt country, right?
Yes.
Okay, imagine a situation when there is a popular movement against corruption in Mexico. Demonstrations, very legitimate campaigns and so on. And a militant group forcefully overthrows the existing government, proclaims itself a government of Mexico, invites Russia to help for partnership, joint military maneuvers. Head of Russia's KGB goes surreptitiously to Mexico City. The best friends are Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And suddenly they are talking about doing an agreement, an economic agreement with Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, at the same time being members of NAFTA. What would be the US reaction to the whole thing? And what I'm saying, these are exactly the things that happened in Ukraine. Exactly. I did not exaggerate anything. Do I say that Putin is right? No, he is very wrong. Very wrong. But he has an idea of how he needs to protect Russia's interests. His ideas are absolutely foreign to me and to many millions of people in Russia. But this is why he did it. It's not because of he wanted to protect the corrupt mafia state. It's not because Ukraine wanted to conclude trade agreement. They were not talking about NATO or anything. Trade agreement with the European Union. And what the Russians were saying all the time, okay, fine, you're a sovereign country, do it. But let's talk how it affects our Russian interests. Just the same as if Mexico, being a member of NAFTA, decided to join Russia and Kazakhstan and do duty-free trade. US would say, no, wait a minute, it's not in our NAFTA agreement. You need to talk to us and to Canada, partners. Okay, I can go on and on, so don't stop me on this.
Thank you, yeah. That's very enlightening, thank you.
We have a couple of minutes, maybe one or two more questions. We're just shy of 5, or 4. 4, right? 4. So we have a couple minutes of one or two more questions if someone would like to ask.
I just wanted to ask the board and Dr. As well, if you had mentioned several times about going in and helping the countries that are prone to terrorism. And how do you feel about the economic advantage or the pyramid of economics and wealth in those countries? I mean, most of the wealth is held in a very few hands in those countries. So how could you really start economic, benefits for the people of their country without the government's help? And I don't think the government wants to share the wealth in those countries. So how would you peacefully put that together? Those countries would like, the sheiks would like all the money to stay in their bank, and they're not really worried about their citizens. And that's why their citizens have really nothing to gain and everything to lose by not becoming rebels. Does that make sense?
Yes. To some extent, that goes back to corruption. How when the money comes in, you have to account. Actually, I think U.S. diplomats account for a certain amount being pocketed when we send money to developing nations, and they actually have to add more money into that. So, like continuing like the UNCIC or Convention Against Corruption, moving that forward to fight corruption and more aggressively could actually reduce how much money we have to put in to help the people, and how effectively that money goes into the country.
I think it's also interesting to bring up this idea of, can we improve the economic systems in these countries to improve the level of the standard of living? And you brought up how it's very unequal at the moment. And I think it's also important to point out that it's still very unequal in the US as well. But perhaps it's because it's the lowest point is a different standard of living than it is out there. And perhaps it's about raising the minimum standard of living. Bianca, do you have anything?
Well, I'm afraid of how to phrase this, I guess, but I would simply say that if we have different a country which, as you said, wants the money for itself, or sorry, groups that want the money for themselves, I would say that if we think in that sort of way, if the UN and other countries providing foreign aid think in that way, yes, it's a hypothetical to raise, but at the same time, I would say it's not necessarily hopeful. Will it necessarily aid the situation if we raise hypotheticals of that nature? I would say that the best way to tackle this is to tackle it with in small tactile ways to begin with, the tangible things that we can handle before completely improving the standard of living in the countries. And I think that is can better quiet the mind, I guess, with hypotheticals of that nature, but at the same time start improving economic standards.
But in benevolence, can you go into a country where the rulers don't want you to be there? That's the problem. They like things as they are, and they run the show.
Well, no, but let's say if a country like the U.S., which is providing foreign aid for a country like Somalia or any terrorist hosting countries, if simply the U.S., I was bringing up the point, is providing only on an average 0.8% of the foreign aid to improving economic stability, why only 0.8%? I'm simply raising the question of, what if the U.S. and other countries and the UN raise that foreign aid economically to improve economic standards? That makes sense.
So you're saying that that would be the way you would try to do it. What if the government wants to keep things as it is, though? Because they have the wealth to help their peoples, but they're not helping their peoples.
Well, I would hope that if a country has the wealth to help the people, then they would increase job opportunities in the country as well as most countries, I hope, would. I'm hopeful that they would do that.
Perhaps that might be a job for the UN as something that doesn't impose on the sovereignty, but instead creates laws and ideals that perhaps will be referenced in the future by future leaders.
It's done. It's being done, yeah.
I want to thank everyone for your input, the panelists for really engaging in a spirited way. You did a great job. Certainly, Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for offering your ideas and reading my 7-paragraph emails once every 3 weeks. We'll probably get one in 2 more weeks. But no, I'm kidding. But thank you, everyone. I know, Anna, you wanted to have some
Yeah, I just wanted to go off of what he was saying. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming and listening and contributing to our conversation. Thank you panelists for making my event so amazing. Dr. Campbell, thank you again. We actually have a gift for you.
Oh.
Here you are from
Thank
all
you.
the panelists.
Thank
And Mr.
you.
Dennis.
You guys.
Oh no, we didn't forget about you. Yeah.
And I must say, it's a wonderful, wonderful group, and I'm very encouraged that there are schools in America with this level of engagement in international affairs, and it's encouraging.
Please feel free, if you, I know a few hours, but if you want to grab a water, Anna has some refreshments for everyone who enjoys. Please feel free to do that.
Thank you very much.